Hey everyone, in this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a highly textured, retro-inspired illustration using Procreate. This illustration will have tons of texture that looks like it was made using physical media, but it was done only using free brushes that come pre-installed with the app when you buy it. I'll be taking some of my favorite artists' work and I'll be using that as inspiration to create something that's more original and in my own style, and I'll walk you through how I do that as well. Again, all of the brushes come installed in Procreate. You never have to buy anything, except there's one brush that I do use in the end. It's optional. I made it myself. I have it available for sale, or you can actually make it pretty easily yourself. We're going to get right into it, but before we do, I just want to say if you like this video, if you learned something from it, please let me know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. So what you're looking at are the essentials. You're going to need an iPad or an iPad Pro with Procreate installed. And of course, you're going to need your Apple Pencil. Other than that, I will be using this optional piece of equipment. It is called the PenPad. It's by PenTips. It's a physical shortcut keyboard for Procreate. I find it really helps speed things up when I'm selecting, cutting and pasting, and quickly switching between my brush and eraser, for example. Basically anything that you do a lot of, especially if it's like you repeat it really rapidly, like cut, paste, this little guy can be really helpful. All right, so now let's go through some of the brushes we'll be using. I just have them listed here in this convenient little spot. Why don't I change my view so you can see them a little more clearly here? Hello, I'm down in the corner. So we have 4 brushes that come installed in Procreate, and then I have just one extra custom brush here called Ink Sponge. So for inking, I'll be using Ink Bleed and Dry Ink, and you can find those under the inking category in your brush library. And then the next set here is the Artist Crayon and the 6B pencil. Both of these can be found in the sketching brush library group here. Artist Crayon is just way down at the bottom. So just as a quick overview of our process today, we're going to start by finding an illustration or an inspiration source to reference, and then we're going to draw that in O mode or observational mode. That basically means copying it by looking at it. And then third, we're going to redraw that same thing, but in what I call I mode or imagination mode. This is where we draw from memory, and that's where we start to see our own style and our own unique way of interpreting the illustration come together. Finally, we're going to create the final illustration using those brushes that we just went through, and I'll walk you through all that. That's probably where we're going to be spending most of our time today. So let's start with finding our inspiration. I'm going to be using an illustration from this book. It's called This is New York. It's by one of my all-time favorite illustrators, Miroslav Sasek. Sasek, I think is how you properly pronounce it. And I'll just show you the one that I've decided I'm going to illustrate from. It's this lovely fire truck. It's super long and hilarious. I really love the way Miroslav Sasek illustrates his style, the way he just brings so much character to things. And I've chosen this one for 2 reasons. First is that I just like it. It looks fun to illustrate. And second, it's really simple. There's not a lot of background or anything like that. It's something that I feel like I can sink into without getting overwhelmed. So when you go out finding your inspiration source, I really think that it will work out best if you find something that is truly more retro, something maybe from the 40s or 50s that uses the kind of qualities we'll be bringing to this. So with that out of the way, let's go and start our O mode illustrations. So I'm gonna just open this up to that fire truck drawing, which is right here. So I'll be doing my O mode and I mode sketches using the 6B pencil that comes in the sketching brush set that comes with Procreate. All right, so now I'm just drawing from this illustration. I am not worried about imitating the style exactly. I'm just trying to draw what I see so that I can learn from it. In this kind of drawing, again, I call this O mode or observational drawing. The goal here is just to almost download the information of the drawing, illustration, or whatever it is to your memory. And drawing something makes it far more easy to remember that thing than if you were to just kind of look at it for a few minutes and try your best to commit it to memory in that sense. So I'm not being too precious here or too fussy. I'm not putting pressure on myself to draw this in the perfect style of, you know, my favorite artist here. I'm just trying to get a sense of what these shapes are so that in the next step, and it's where things get really interesting, I will be able to at least remember some of the key takeaways here. We'll see what happens. I'm just going to try and keep going and not get stuck. Sometimes you just got to trust the process. And even though it feels like right now I'm feeling mixed up, I feel like I'm not doing it perfect. And I kind of want to just restart so that I'm doing not only the drawing correctly, but I'm doing this video more clearly and stuff like that. And I have learned over the years that it's often better just to keep going even when you feel like things are going wrong or things are going off the rails a little bit. Keep going a little bit longer, especially if you've been here before. You can trust that process and know that you'll have something to work with, and you'll certainly have a lot more to work with if you just let yourself keep going and don't stop, don't give up. So for this next stage, we're gonna draw completely from memory. I'm going to hide the sketch. I'm going to put my reference material away. And now it's just a matter of seeing how well can I remember what I drew. Now, without looking at your O-mode drawing or the original illustration, redraw it from memory. You can base it as closely or loosely on the original as you'd like. Either way, you won't remember everything, but you should have enough information to redraw the object or scene in your own way. How you fill in for the things you forget is part of what will make this more original and not just a straight copy. This I-mode drawing will be the sketch on which you create the final illustration next. Keep in mind, you don't need to include the entire composition of the original. You can just focus in on a part, and that's what I'm doing here. All right, so I'm pretty much done my I-mode sketch here. I just want to add a little bit of a background, just something to add a little bit of something. I think it will be more interesting. So I'm going to add some skyline. This is something that I saw in the book, a little bit of a New York skyline thing happening. And this will just, it will just help make things a little bit more interesting. And I'll figure out exactly how I will render this in the more finished illustration in the next stage. But yeah, I'm just going to rough that in as a little indication to myself that that's something that I'll want to include as well. If I decide it's too complicated or I get stuck, it's optional. I'm going to focus mainly on doing this fire truck. So at this point, I'm done my I-mode sketch. I just want to say that if you got stuck along the way, you're not used to drawing from memory. I do this all the time, so I'm very used to it. If you get stuck, you can cheat. You can look at your reference image just to remember a little bit of what was going on there. But I just encourage you, as much as you can, try not to lean on that and trust in your mistakes. And know that some of those mistakes could end up being kind of the most interesting parts of your illustration later on. Especially if your goal is to not imitate, but to do something a little bit more innovative. So once you're done your I-mode sketches, it's time to start your finished illustration where you add the color and the texture and all that lovely stuff. So first we're going to choose our colors. So this is where the magic begins, I guess. So we're going to be creating final art that just has 3 colors that can interact with one another. I recommend choosing one darker color. I always use this kind of dark navy blue. And then two other colors that I will call bright colors. So maybe your first bright is red, like mine. I'm using red because of the fire engine and just that overall color that appeared in my inspiration art. I'm also using yellow quite simply because a lot of yellow factored into that illustration as well. So I'm just using these three colors, and then when these are multiplied over one another, I'm using the multiply blending mode in the layers panel here. And when they overlap with one another, you get these really nice, rich, extra tones, sort of like what I would call an overprint, where one ink would print over another ink in certain printing processes. So your colors can be inspired by the original reference that you're drawing from, or you can choose new ones. I would just look for two distinct colors that combine in a nice way. So I've chosen red and yellow, but you could have just as well chosen maybe yellow and blue. And then the way they overlapped created this nice green color. So why wouldn't you just use a fourth color if you wanted green as well? Well, that's because the fewer colors you work with, the more creative you have to be in how you use them. And this is also how many older retro style illustrators had to work. They were given only 2 or 3 inks to work with, and then they had to stretch them as far as they could. And that's part of what gives a lot of those retro illustrations their look. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is just prepare our layers in our Procreate file. We're just going to work in the same file that we started with our sketches. So I know I don't need that original sketch that I made, so I'll just hide that. And for the sketch I'll be working from, I want to just decrease the opacity so that it doesn't dominate my view here, but I can still see it. And I also like to set the layer blending mode to multiply, and that really just ensures that whatever art I'm making beneath it shows through. And on that note, I'm going to create 3 layers beneath my sketch. You can name these if you want. I'm just going to leave them as they are and kind of keep track of them. You want each of these to be multiplied over one another. So you should see a little M in the blending mode there. All of these should be multiplied because that's where we're going to get those nice interacting colors that we just went through. Now, I'm not sure if I said it yet, but each of these layers is going to be dedicated to each of your colors. So I'm going to have the bottom layer here is my dark layer, and then I'll use red maybe on layer 4 and yellow on layer 5. It doesn't matter what order your colors appear in the layers because they're all multiplied over one another. It's just that you want to make sure you're only using one color per layer. So on the bottom layer, I'll dedicate that to my darkest color, and I'm going to use the Artist Crayon brush set at a fairly large size and just lightly fill in using my Apple Pencil. I'm pressing very lightly. I don't want this to become overbearing, but I'm also not lifting my pencil. I'm trying to keep it down this whole time. And this just gives my white page a bit of texture, and this helps me overcome my fear of the blank page, but it also gives a little bit of that retro ambience or texture right away. I really feel like this kind of sets the stage for the rest of the artwork to happen. The next thing to do is to add in your first major shapes. So I'm gonna add in the most obvious shapes to start. I'll start with red, and for this I'm going to use my dry ink brush. This is in the inking brush set, and I'll keep it at a fairly small size. It's not tiny, but it's not too chunky either. And we're going to draw in our most obvious shapes to start. I'm freehanding this, and I don't have smoothing set or anything like that in my preferences for this brush. If you want, you can put on pressure smoothing, and that will give you a more consistent kind of stroke, a smoother stroke. I like a bit of the freehand action that I get without doing that. And I'm just drawing in the outlines of these basic shapes. Anything that was red that I remember in the original artwork there, I'll make red here. I remember this windshield was outlined, So I can just leave that as is. But then for the rest, I can just go in and fill the whole thing, making sure that it's filled right to the edge and there's no faint line happening between the outline and what I've filled in. And that's usually just at the threshold before it fills the whole page, if that makes sense. So I'm just dragging in and then holding down my pencil, and that allows you to adjust that threshold value. Basically, a higher threshold means it's going to try and bleed out of the lines more, and a lower threshold means it's going to try and stay within those outlines. So something that is somewhere in the middle in this case is going to work fine. Also want to get that nice big light at the top. I'm just using my ink bleed brush to refine some of the edges here, which I find are too rounded, and some of these just feel a little bit too blurry at the edge, and my ink bleed has a finer point. So now I'm going to go to my last remaining layer, and this of course will be my second bright color, or my third color overall, and I'll start blocking in those shapes as well. So for this one, I'm using my ink bleed brush because these are slightly smaller elements, being the faces. And this is where maybe if you're not used to this, it will mess with your head a little bit. But I'm planning on making those jackets not just the dark blue color, but a little bit of a richer color. So I'll use yellow, I should say, for that. And that means I'm just going to draw in their actual jackets in addition to their heads. It's all attached. It's all like one layer. It's all one color. And we work out adding some of those details just one thing at a time. And I'm adding a little bit more jacket here than I had in the sketch, and that's okay. And while I'm adding to this yellow, I think the helmets will also have some of that yellow hue in them. So I'm just kind of filling those in as well. This may feel very counterintuitive if you're not used to illustrating in this way, but we'll get a chance to define those faces with extra colors and stuff in a moment. Don't worry about being too messy here. There's lots of chance to clean things up and refine as we keep going. So I'm going to just go over to my yellow layer here. I'm going to use the selection tool, just make sure that it's set to freehand. I'm going to cut out these eyes. And just hit cut, that little scissors button. And just like that, I have white areas for the eyes. Now I think that's good for the yellow layer for now. I'm going to go back to the dark layer. That's where we put that grungy texture. And of course I'll select my dark color to draw in here and choose an appropriate brush. I'll just go to Recents, where I can see all the brushes I've been working with. I'm going to go back to my dry ink brush. Maybe I'll just go back to that bigger size. Yeah, I think that'll work. For the tires, I can always refine some of these details if I need to later on. And of course I'll just try and fill this in. Now filling in here may not work as well because of that grungy texture that's already on this layer. If I hit some of that ink here like I did just there, if I hit some of these marked in places, it's not going to fill in. But if I can find a blank area, it'll fill in just fine. And then I can just go in around the edge there just to make sure that it's filled in all the way to the edge. And I will use an eraser, and I'm going to set this eraser to ink bleed. And this should give me a nice fine point eraser just to take out some of these details. And at this point, I can just start adding in some of these details with the brush, drawing, and then filling. So while I'm here, I'm going to actually go back to the dry ink brush, which is a little bigger, and add in the fire helmets. Again, this is where the PenPad comes in handy if I need to just quickly switch between erase and brush mode. I know that some of you will be used to using just the button or the like tap thing that you can do on your Apple Pencil. I always have it disabled because I always accidentally tap that when I don't mean to, and it's irritating. So I just don't like that. It's too easy to make a mistake with. And so I've disabled that. Now I have an opportunity to bring in some of that definition that I was losing before. For example, the nose here, and here I'll add in some of the uniform. Now for the stripes on this guy's uniform, I'm going to use the selection tool and just cut those out rapidly like this. See how that looks. If I don't like it, I'll just use the brush instead. Or I can just edit those back in using the brush and the eraser. Now the thing about this process, when you're working on just 3 layers, things get a little messy, you don't have as much control, and for instance, as I'm erasing the dark layer, sometimes I erase a little bit of the texture behind here, and I'll just have to figure out how to bring some of that back in later. And I just trust that doing it this way in a sort of less controlled way, not being in total control of which part of the texture I remove or don't remove as I'm erasing something else, I trust that the artifacts that get left behind in that process will give this a much more handmade feeling. Like, I'm not too worried about, for example, some of these lines are cut out and some of these lines are drawn in. Like what I'm doing now, I'm turning a cut line into a drawn line, and I'm not too worried about that. I remember that this guy had these funny little boots. And then the parts here were like these really big cuffs of his pants or his boots, whatever. I'm going to erase that. I'm now going to go to the red layer and try and reload that same selection and cut that out as well. And then I'll also go to the yellow layer and do the same thing. I just press and hold the selection tool. It should reload what I last selected, and then I'll cut it, and I have these nice clean white areas. I'll go back to my dark layer and just add some detail in there, and I can always go back there and add more texture or something if I need it. So I'm not going to go in and add some details. Some of these I have in my sketch, and some of these I will have to just kind of wing it. Your sketch is kind of like a guide to your final, but you don't have to draw every single thing in your sketch in your final illustration. The sketch is just there to help you know where to place your color and shapes and stuff like that, more or less. I'm going to use my selection tool here, and for these places in the art that are kind of more in the background, like there and on this part back here, this would be the front of the trailer that has the ladder. I've created a selection. I'm going to choose my artist crayon brush. That's the grungy texture that I've been using, and just color over a little bit darker in those areas that might be a bit heavy-handed. Maybe I'll just be a little bit more subtle. I think that gives it a little bit more interesting nuance there. I'm going to go back to my red layer now, and again with my selection tool, I'm going to cut out some of the parts that I remember being in white. And then I can add back in some of these areas in red that just got erased out. Kind of like how that popped out. It was fun. A little brushing in, and erasing out. And at this point, I'm just kind of switching between my different layers as I need to. Just remembering to use the correct color for each layer. So now I'm using that dry brush as an eraser to take out the hub cap area of these wheels. And I can go back in with my artist crayon and really set it to a much smaller size. We'll see if this works. To bring in some of that grungy texture again inside the wheel well areas and in those hubs. And just like I did with some of the other parts of the red fire engine, I'm going to do the same here with the selection tool. I'm going to use that artist crayon just to grunge up and darken some of the red there. Let me just see how this looks without the sketch. I think I may roll with it. I'm going to go back to using my ink bleed as my eraser and just kind of take out some of this in here. I might even try just using the selection tool. See if I can just cut that out more precisely. Okay, that feels way too harsh. For now, I'm just going to leave it. So at this point, maybe I'll make some of the faces a different tone. And I think what I'll do is use the artist crayon and the selection tool to do that. I'm on the red layer, and I'll just make some of these guys have red faces. I don't have any correct skin colors here, so I can just kind of be loosey-goosey with the skin tones here. I'm just going to go and make sure I'm on the red layer and make sure that I have red selected as my color, and go in with my artist crayon and gently brush in some red wherever I selected. I might just make this a little bit smaller. And of course, I don't want them to have bloodshot eyes like that. This is a case where I'm going to have to go back in with my eraser and bring back that white. That just gives a little bit more tonality to some of the faces there. I'll go to the yellow layer here, and I want to get some kind of a hand happening with this guy hanging onto the truck. So I'm actually just going to, let's see, do something like that. Continue into the red. Maybe he's wearing white gloves or something like that. Now I'm going to turn this ink bleed eraser or ink bleed brush and use it as an eraser. If I press and hold the eraser with my Apple Pencil, it will turn my current brush into the eraser. It will set the eraser as the same brush, basically. Okay, I'm going to go back to my dry ink brush in red, bring some of these spokes to the hubs. I think for these wheels, I want to add red all over. So I'm going to set my brush to artist crayon and just kind of dab in, just with a smaller size, some of that texture, just to blend the spokes and the wheels a little bit more. So yeah, I've lost some of the definition of those spokes, but they stood out a little bit too much. They looked just too hand drawn in or something like that. And then switching back to my dark layer, I think I'll add some more of this fine detail here. Now I have no idea what was going on here. It was some kind of hitch mechanism. So I'm just gonna draw what I remember, which was sort of like a triangle thingy, and just, I don't know, leave it in there. I think there was some, I could turn on my sketch again, just so I remember what these parts are. Some kind of antenna situation there. And there was a canister, like an oxygen canister, or maybe it was a fire extinguisher. So I can knock that out of the red. I can also knock that out of the dark area. Now, often when I draw my lines, I like to kind of erase out just the end points of them, because the end points are kind of these little dead giveaways that you've used an artificial or a digital brush. The way a brush ends when you lift is programmed into the brush, and so often that ending repeats itself so many times in a drawing that it begins to look very digital made, even if you've used these kind of more textured style brushes. So I like to go in and just customize my ends by just erasing them and squaring them off a little bit. All right, so let's go to the ladder. I think for the ladder, I'll use my dry ink brush in dark. I'm not too worried about like how accurate this is. I'm not looking at a photograph of a fire engine or ladder truck. I do feel like the ladder is a bit heavy though. In that sense, I might just lighten up on some of the lines. Now at this point for the typography, or the lettering I should say, I'm just using my ink bleed brush to erase out these numbers, just adding a few little extra details. And of course, I'm erasing these out of the red layer. I remember also that it was on the front here. And I think I'll also go to that dark layer and erase some of that as well. So I'm going to go back to my yellow layer here, and I'm going to use my artist crayon and just kind of set it slightly larger size, not too big, not too small, and add in just a little bit of this yellow, get more tonality in that red, make it richer. And I may not be coming through here in the overhead view, so why don't I show you on the iPad view. You can really see how that red becomes much more rich with that yellow layered over it. And I'm being a little bit deliberately messy with it just to get that all over the place, especially in that red light up at the top, maybe in the bell up there. It kind of blends things a little bit more. One thing that I'm not necessarily happy with is how solid that yellow jacket is on the guy. It feels just like super solid. So I think what I might do there is maybe with the artist crayon set as my eraser brush, take out a little bit of that so that doesn't do anything. So what I can do here is just over top that yellow layer, I'm going to use white. I set my brush to white. This layer is not multiply or anything. And then just kind of faintly color in some of this texture. I'm not going to leave that like that. That doesn't look too good in my opinion. So I'm going to just create a selection from that layer. I'm going to tap that layer, and then there's an option toward the top there to select. And with that selection loaded, I can actually hide that white layer, go to my yellow layer, and then go cut. And it sort of takes a selection of that white area that I just made and takes it away from the yellow. This is better. I do want to add back some of that yellow, and I'll do that by hand using my dry ink brush, which has some built-in texture. And I'll just do it lightly. And this will create a little bit more of a textured yellow area, and it won't be so flat looking. And I could also do that with the black as well, which kind of came in pretty heavy as well. So what I could do is go to the black layer and do the same thing. I could even use that same layer that I made before. Go select, and then down to that dark layer, cut. And yes, definitely that black or that navy is less flat, and I'll go back in with my dry ink at a slightly larger size just to add back in some texture so it doesn't look so obviously cut out like that. There's a bit of a weird digital look to that texture right now. And some of this stuff I'm just figuring it out as I go along, and if I really mess up, I'll have to drop all back in again. But I'm just trying to roll with what's happening here and try to lose a little bit of that control, which gives this whole thing that more spontaneous look, which we want. That made a big difference, just that shoulder. Let's take a look without the sketch now. I think this is looking pretty good. We have the basic art down now. I think I just want to fill in some texture on that bell. I got lost. Might have to do something with that. The yellow is not really holding up. I'll just leave that for now. I didn't like how that bell was looking. There's an interesting space there though that maybe I'll just try something else. I want to see this guy's hand. So I'm gonna just go in and freeball it a bit, add in an arm, and go to the dark layer. That's not really working out either. I was imagining at first that he was kind of ringing the bell with his other hand. What would that look like? Now, of course, I don't want his hand to be outlined like this exactly because I'm not doing that anywhere else. I'm just kind of roughing it in for now. Sometimes the more defined you try and be, the more it looks kind of troubled and overworked. And if it's not going to work out, I'm just going to leave it out. Okay, I figured it out. I don't want his hand showing at all. I want a bell. I'll go back with the yellow, and his hand is in the bell, clanging it, and we'll just make it work. I mean, what were these even hanging on in the original? I don't know. Like the horn here and the bell, what was going on? I don't know. I'm going to use the 6B pencil because it's a little bit more subtle and just bring a little bit of definition here that I couldn't do with any of the other brushes. We're going to let that be. I think the next thing to do will be to add some of that background. And again, I'm not looking at any of my references, just the sketch that I made in iMode here. So what I want to do now is add that background, but I don't want to wreck my precious illustration as I've made it so far. So what I'm going to do is create an extra layer just above that dark layer, and I'm gonna create that background on that layer, and then later I can flatten that down onto the original dark layer if I want. Now, it really doesn't matter how many layers I have here. I've just set my 3 layers as my constraint with my 3 colors, and that helps me work within some constraints that gives me limits that force me to work in a certain way, or if you want to put it, it forces me to work in a certain style. If I have too many options and everything's possible and I don't have any limits, then it just opens up too many possibilities for me to keep using new brushes or new layers. And that's when your style breaks apart and things become inconsistent and the harmony of the piece breaks down. Having limits that you kind of build into your technique and what you will and won't do gives your art its sense of harmony. So I'm on my extra layer here. I'm going to go to my dry ink brush, and I'm just going to go and draw in outlines of buildings in the background like this. I'm not going to worry if things overlap what's going on beneath just yet. This is a pretty chunky brush, I will admit. So in terms of my composition, I'm trying to keep the bottom third white, and then I'll leave the top part, the top 2/3 here, as more of this more involved background, if you will. I'm just kind of freeballing it here, and I know that a lot of these details will work out in the end. So I want these to have a sense of windows, and I should say this is inspired by what I've seen in the book. I'm not just totally making up how these buildings look, just looking at even what's on the cover here. You have these buildings and they're all just the one color, that dark color, with the windows made up of just crisscrossed lines, or hatching, or hashing. Is it hashing or hatching? I think it's hashing, where you make sort of a waffle grid with your inker. And so that's where I got this idea. I'm just not directly referencing Shashak art here, just more remembering what I'd seen earlier. So try not to be too the same in every single building. I want there to be some consistency and some variety, and that will keep the background kind of sitting a little bit more quietly in the background. Don't want it to be too loud. I mean, it is right now, but it won't be once I take care of a few things, once I develop it further. I'm using a lighter line weight for between the thicker lines in some cases. It just gives a little bit of variety back there. Now, even though this is a quick background, it's still taking some patience for me not to totally rush it, trying to be deliberate with each of my little strokes here. You can balance being deliberate and loose. I think that's where some magic happens. Now, keep in mind, I'm not destroying my artwork that I've spent all this time making. There's a plan. We're going to get to that in a moment. But right now, I'm just focused on making that nice skyline in the background on its own layer. And really, I'm just using 2 line weights, the thick one and the thin one that I'm doing right now. And I guess I used the third line weight here with the overall outlines of each building, just to give them a bit of separation. Maybe I want to bring back something up here. And I'm not being literal about the New York skyline. I don't know what's really there. We're working in a very stylized way. If I were to start being super literal about the background skyline and with like very recognizable skyscrapers that you'd see in New York, it could be very distracting. So we're not going to do that. So you'll notice that while the lines of these background buildings are very messy and rough, because I've done them very consistently and they match everything else in the illustration, they kind of just work there. I might find a little thing here or there to pick on, but as long as you're consistent, things can kind of hold together, even if they're messy. So now I want to bring back, of course, the fire truck and the fireman and clear out some of that background that I made. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that layer of buildings and put them behind my original dark layer. So you can see now that those buildings are behind the all the other dark elements, and because those dark elements above are multiplied, you get kind of that darker part where they interact, and that's totally fine. That's fine. We're gonna go with that. I'm just gonna put a new layer just above those buildings. I'm gonna use my ink sponge brush that I made myself and use white and just dab, maybe make this a tad bigger, just like a sponge behind. And this kind of gives a nice grainy texture to everything, letting some of the black come through. You don't want everything to be totally clean in this style of illustration. There needs to be a little bit of messiness, and that's really what gives it all its charm. So there is kind of my first go at just separating the dark buildings from the fire truck and everything. Now if I want, on that same white layer, I can go in with a smaller brush and just kind of draw in anywhere that I really want to clean out as much of that texture as possible. I don't want it to be totally obvious where that stops down here. Like it's a little bit of an edge that you can see where the texture is, and then it suddenly stops, and I want to make that a little bit more gradual. Now the other thing that I'd like to do is add on my yellow layer. I'm just gonna be really risky here and draw my spongy stuff just right on that yellow layer. So anything I'm doing here is going to be permanent on my yellow layer, not on a separate layer like I did the background. And this just gives the buildings more of a night vibe. And then I'm gonna go to my buildings or my skyline. I'm gonna just draw in with that texture just over them. That was a bit too dark. Let me start again. Just that sense of nighttime. I'm okay with destroying those buildings a little bit. This is a permanent move. You know, they're all on the same layer. If you want, you can do it on a separate layer or copy your skyline layer just in case. But again, I like to pretend this is like actual physical media where there is no undo button, and try and work like that as much as possible. I'd like to add in just a few tiny details. I mean, for instance, it's nighttime, so these buildings should have some little red lights. And then, of course, to make those red lights really pop, I'm going to go back down to that layer with the buildings, with that night texture, and just erase out. So you see that glow. It's a nice tiny little repeated detail that just, it's like a little touch that adds to the story. I think I'd also like to add a fire because, well, it's a fire truck scene. So why don't we say one of the buildings is on fire. We'll choose this one. Sorry, everybody. And we'll make sure that we're on the red layer. And draw a simple little stylized fire here. And I'm just going to maybe use my ink sponge brush at a smaller size, much smaller size, just to get out. I'm not sure this is going to work. Just to get out some of that. I'm not sure I like that. But I want to get some of that dark out there so the fire stands out. Sometimes a good brush for this kind of thing would be the 6B pencil. So I'm not totally erasing everything. And again, trying not to overthink it. I'll maybe go back over a little bit with the yellow and the sponge to give that a little bit more heat. I don't know why these guys are so happy, but I do want their eyes to be darker. I'm going to go back to the yellow layer, which I'm already on, and just draw in over those eyes so they're darker. These are all just finishing touches. Sometimes in the end I've really loosened up and I'm not too precious about anything. So now I feel like I've added every possible detail. At this point I think I'm just going to overwork it. It's got texture, it's got that nighttime feeling, it's got some happy firemen, it's got a fire, and so I'm ready to go and put my signature on this and call it a day. Alright, that concludes this tutorial where you learned how to create a stunning retro style illustration in Procreate. If you found this video helpful, please let me know with a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to say thanks for this free tutorial, please use the affiliate links in the video description. They help me to keep making more content like this one. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. My name is Mr. Tom Froese. Don't forget to check out my Skillshare classes about illustration and, of course, my podcast, Thoughts on Illustration. I'll see you in the next one.